So we get to start today with September, our September series, which is all about our homecoming theme this month, and that is rediscover, reconnect, and renew. And though last week was August, I do kind of want to segue a little bit from my August talk into September, because I feel it's quite fitting. So last week, I talked about setting boundaries as spiritual practice. And I shared with you all the need for us at times to create those boundaries, to say, this is me, this is not me. This is okay, this is not okay. This hurts and limits my spiritual growth, or it doesn't. It's about thinking about boundary as a symbolic force field. It's a way of what you need to be in your God self. So we enforce boundaries for that reason, so that we can be able to feel that we are in our truth and our authentic self, and so that we don't get into not asserting our boundaries and then becoming angry or resentful or engaged in toxic behaviors or what have you. So there's an importance, as I said last week, to creating boundaries. Today, we're going to kind of be flipping the script a little bit to look at boundaries in a way that also may be limiting for us. Because sometimes we have set boundaries in our life that may no longer be useful. We've set boundaries in our life that are not necessarily where we want to be anymore, but we've set them, and sometimes we don't know how to change them. Or we set them in our life and we don't even realize that the boundaries that we have about how we talk or how we think or what we do are really limiting who we can be in this life. And we're limiting our engagement and our ability to love, be loved, and be love in expression. So we're going to talk about that today, how the world is changing and really begs us to start questioning what are personal and collective boundaries. What are our boundaries in this changing world? And how do we prepare ourselves to rediscover and to reconnect and to renew? Now, I'm going to start off in a really strange place. Y'all are going to think, what did I smoke this morning? I'm going to start talking to you all this morning about hot dogs. Yes, hot dogs. Anybody ever had a Chicago hot dog? Yes, so as y'all know, I'm from Chicago, and Chicago is synonymous for many things, especially around food. We got Chicago pizza, and we've got the great Chicago hot dog. For those of you who don't know, this magnificent culinary creation is a poppy seed bun, an all beef frank, don't get it twisted, all beef frank, yellow mustard, chopped white onion, not red onion, tomato, sweet pickle relish, a dill pickle spear, swart peppers, which are a little spicy, and celery salt. That is what is the classic Chicago hot dog. Now, what many of y'all may not know is that the Chicago dog actually was birthed many years before with the wave of immigrants that came to Chicago. In the 1840s, folks came over from Germany and brought over their culture of sausage making and, of course, the Frankfurter. So that was something that became popular. Chicago became a meat packing industry area. It was something that became synonymous with meat Chicago. Then we have the start of the Great Depression. And there was obviously a lot of poverty and joblessness and ways in which people were just struggling to find a way to make a living and struggling to find a way to eat. And along comes another group of immigrants, the Jewish community. And they took up jobs as street vendors. And they sold these amazing hot dogs in little carts on the street. It was a very inexpensive way of getting a meal, and it was kind of a garden on your dog, right? There's some vegetables. So it was a way of getting a tasty and somewhat nutritious meal for a very low price. Now, you notice that what I said was all the ingredients, but you notice I didn't say ketchup, right? Now, y'all may not know this, but a Chicago proper, quote-unquote, hot dog does not have ketchup. President Barack Obama, who is also a former Chicagoan, once famously stated that ketchup does not belong on a hot dog once you're past 8 years old. Now, legendary Chicago newspaper columnist Mike Royko did admit that if anyone wanted to put ketchup on their hot dog, they would have the right to do so, but he went on to clarify his opinion. He said, quote, "It is also their right to put mayo or chocolate syrup or toenail clippings or cat hair on a hot dog. Sure, it would be disgusting and perverted, and they would be shaming themselves and their loved ones, but under our system of government, it is their right to be barbarians." That's some serious stuff, right, around hot dogs. I didn't grow up with the typical Chicago hot dog. I actually remember having ketchup on my hot dog till much later in life. You know, I grew up with a Mexican grandmother, and believe it or not, we ate hot dogs on a tortilla with mayonnaise. Go figure. It was delicious then. Don't know if it is now for me. Why am I talking about hot dogs? Chicago became synonymous with the hot dog, and then of course we think, this is the way it should be. This is the Chicago dog. And so we have this wonderful idea that it became a thing that was legendary based on the changing complexities of the time, of the communities, of new waves of immigrants and new cultures that the city was being exposed to that changed the dynamics and the boundaries of food and what was considered synonymous with Chicago. I don't know if there really should or shouldn't be ketchup on a hot dog, but it tells us something about this nature of shifting boundaries and what becomes acceptable or not acceptable. Let's even take it a little bit more local and talk about Nashville. Now we have Nashville being synonymous with what? Hot chicken. See, everybody knew that. And some people are like, oh God, no way. Like, that's not Southern, right? Some people, I've heard some people say that. I mean, there's hot chicken places in Chicago and all places all over the country, probably all over the world. Now, with all of these changes, we've got this thing now that becomes this cultural icon. As the city changes, I don't know if many of you know, but there's about 14% Latinos in Nashville now. There are some communities around, not too far here from our church, that are up to 30% Latinos in those zip codes. The Latino population in the last 10 years has more than doubled and increasingly continues to grow. So, I don't know, are tacos Southern now? Pupusas that are Central American? I don't know. But I talk about this to beg the question that things are changing. I come here to Nashville, and for the first time, I saw a lot of churches identifying with this idea of progressive Christianity. And up north, as far as I know, in all my years in Unity, I've never heard that. And so clearly it's this demarcation, this wanting to set a boundary or back off from a type of boundary that denotes what Christianity is. Within that, unity is changing, and I've said this numerous times from the platform. I myself, when Reverend Linda Martello Whitsitt came a few weeks ago, was really shocked. I said she's like the queen of prayer, the diva of prayer for unity. She was a vice president at Unity over Silent Unity. The prayer mecca for us. And when she did her prayer retreat or her prayer workshop, she actually had us get up and she had us do walking prayer and she had us do prayer with movement. And I remember going to her after the training and said, wow, that really kind of blew my socks off, because normally I don't see that when we understand prayer and unity. And as a matter of fact, I myself have been criticized for not following unity type prayer, because we're used to this very deep and quiet, introspective prayer, and whereas that is what we bring, the silence, right? As we talk about with the Fillmores, there's also more. And so she said, no, well, I was a praying yoga teacher and meditator, and so I felt like there was something missing, and this is what I'm bringing now to the unity experience. I was like, wow, that's great. Sometimes we don't understand that we become part of collective consciousness without knowing it. We carry within us, in the way we think and the way we speak and the way we act, with a consciousness that comes from the collective environment. Our co-founder, Charles Fillmore, called that race consciousness. I find it really unfortunate that we don't talk more about that in Unity, because I think it's such an important concept that he really tried to develop. He says that the race consciousness is the sum of past and present thoughts, beliefs, concepts, and ideas prevalent among mankind. It has been said that possibly the greater part of our thinking did not begin with our cradle or at our cradle. That is a sum of the thoughts of those born before us, producing the atmosphere we are born into and causing our thoughts to have the same general character as theirs. Of many persons, it might be said that they are living dead men's lives, since they are thinking dead men's thoughts. The thoughts of those who have lived before us may either be helpful and uplifting or depressing and limiting. As generations of self-centered, self-conscious men have succeeded each other, it is the limiting thoughts principally, that have been accepted and impressed on the succeeding generations. The stream of thought thus established, with its strong currents drawing all thought in their direction, is the race thought or the race consciousness. Pretty powerful words back in the early 1900s. And what he's saying to us is that we don't realize sometimes how our thoughts are dominated. Maybe in modern contextual language, some people might want to say that as being part of unconscious bias or part of the subconscious mind. We can think about it as many different ways. But it becomes important for us to identify, like I mentioned last week when I mentioned the passage from Ephesians that was saying that we're not always dealing with flesh and blood thoughts, or rather flesh and blood people or things. We are dealing with something from the beyond. And this is kind of what we're flagging in some ways, the beyond, that we're steeped in a culture sometimes that we don't even see how it is negatively influencing our lives or is no longer serving itself. Maybe it served itself for a while, but it's not anymore. So part of what I'm trying to offer you all today is for us to kind of start thinking through, where do I sit with this race consciousness? Where am I with all of this? And is there anything in my consciousness that is still connected to this larger global thought that may not be working for me or the world anymore? These are questions I pose only for you all to know and answer. Charles Fillmore, in his 1926 book, Talks on Truth, talks about that time that was really a really accelerated time in our history. So many things were changing, the Industrial Revolution, all sorts of strife in the world. You had the birth of the New Thought movement, just before that at the turn of the century. So there were a lot of things happening, right, that were causing all of this strife or all of this reassessment, all of this way to think about how things were happening. And so what he shares in this book is this idea that we have to not look at the forms of the world, not the materiality of the world, but the spirit of things. So he's saying at that time, people are so caught up with this is how you have to be a Christian, or this is how you have to have a worship service, or this is what has to be said or not said. And he came forth and he said, we really need to rethink that, because it's not about what the material is showing. It's about, are we in spirit? Are we of spirit? Are we following spirit? He says spiritual thinking is a pioneer that opens the way into the new birth, but it must be followed by spiritual acting on the part of every faculty. He goes on to say that in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus speaks in Matthew 5, Jesus is laying down the law for those who desire to follow him into the regeneration, to be born again. And so he says, if you seek this spiritual birth, examine your daily life and see whether you are conforming to the requirements. When we think about what he's flagging with Jesus, Jesus was the master boundary setter as well as the master boundary pusher. He was always wanting to say, are these boundaries really making sense? He was critiqued and ultimately crucified for destroying tradition. But what he said in Matthew 5 as well was, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come to fulfill them. There's a big twist there. He too is flagging the race consciousness in the Charles Fillmore kind of word, that we're too focused at that time. The Hebrews and even the Romans are too focused on formalism and the rules and customs. He wants to look at the spirit of the law. Jesus wants to go back to the truth, go back to the spirit. When he's talking to the Pharisee Nicodemus in John chapter 3, verse 5, Nicodemus is a Pharisee, which is a spiritual leader. He's a major spiritual leader at the time. And Nicodemus comes in the dark of night because he's starting to have conflict about whether all these negative things that are being said about Jesus are true. And he's starting to kind of open to the idea like, man, maybe this guy's got something. Like, why am I feeling drawn to want to know more about what he's saying? And one of the things that ends up being what Jesus tells him is that he has to be born again, that he has to let go of what he thinks he knows in order to truly live and be of the Spirit. And he's calling him to question on what he has inherited as spiritual beliefs, as cultural beliefs, as religious beliefs, as gendered beliefs. Every belief he's calling the question on. Nicodemus is the Pharisee side of the mentality that observes the external forms of religion without understanding their real meaning. And as we know, Jesus is wanting to engage the population in his time around these questions of boundaries. He's wanting to question this collective consciousness. He's wanting to push the boundaries around this race consciousness. The question that I offer you all today and that I ask is, where in your life are you holding to the Nicodemus or the Pharisee mentality? And maybe it's with your children. I know when I was raising my daughter, boy, did I learn a lot about life and a lot about having this mentality that was so limiting. She was brought into the expression of life that was very free And she also was diagnosed with what most people call ADHD, or attention deficit disorder. And so for me, it was hard learning how to parent her because she was so different and her boundaries were so different. So, I was a classic kind of bookworm nerd, did really well in school, classic studying, got the books, everything's quiet, I'm sheltered, really focused. And she wanted to play music. And I thought, what? So I fought with her for so long about that until I started to say, maybe my boundaries are not working with her. Maybe what serves her or works for her or allows her spirit to soar and her intuition and her intellect to expand is not what I believe is mine. We all have that in our life. Maybe it's with our spouses or our coworkers where we're holding to these rigid boundaries where we get upset about them when in reality, in the larger scheme of things, maybe they're not that big of a deal. I remember telling a friend one time, about my mom, something or another, and I was kind of probably complaining a little bit. And she looked at me dead in the eye and she said, "At least you have a mother. I don't have one to complain about." I was like, woof, slap in the face. Because her mother had passed away when she was a little girl. We forget sometimes that the little things in life are not really worth having to toil over or stress about or focus on. It's looking at these larger pictures of spirit and how we move into our God selves and how we pray and how we meditate to be able to take in that beat, to be able to let go and disperse that race consciousness, disconnect from that connectious consciousness, and then really be in the truth. When we take that beat, when we take that silence, Spirit will come rushing in to give you the information that you need, the next step to take, the person to talk to, the apology to give, or the text not to send. We are in a time together where all of these worlds are colliding. A lot is shifting and changing. And I want you to understand that this is all normal. It is all healthy as long as we understand and keep a higher vision and keep in principle. The film wars called to this, a New Thought folks called this back in the day, chemicalization. Does anybody remember that, chemicalization? It's where your old thoughts are meeting your new thoughts and they're colliding. It's like this chemical reaction, literally, that is happening in your body, in your community, in your home, in your world. And it's going to happen. You're going to have that clash where there's just this energy. But here's what Charles Fillmore says. Do not be frightened. Actually, my apologies. This is H. Emily Cady in Lessons of Truth. She says, do not be frightened. That which you feel is on the spiritual plane. A similar excitement and agitation to that which was seen in the chemical action between the alkali and the acid on the material plane. And something higher and better always results. So no matter what is happening, we have to claim that truth. That something better is being born, that we are being born anew, that we are stepping into something that we don't know and understand, but we anchor ourselves in truth, in principle, in love, in community and connection. And when we do that, all the material is not as important or cataclysmic or necessitates large amounts of conversation or strife. I want to close with two quick stories. I was talking the other day to a ministerial colleague, and I don't know how we got on the topic of New Thought music. And he said that one day he had gone to an event, a New Thought event, and the music team was playing very traditional Southern Christian type hymns, I guess. And he came from a very rigid background with very tight boundaries about what religiosity was, and he was triggered by it. In his world at that moment, in his spiritual development, he just wasn't resonating with it. So he walked out, waited till the music was done, and came back in. Later, a colleague of him came up to him and said, "I saw you step out. Is everything okay?" And he said, "Well, the music, really, I just wasn't feeling it, so I left." And so his colleague said, "Well, it's just different music. If it had been maybe a Buddhist chant or a Hindu spiritual hymn or something, would you have stayed?" And he said, "Yeah, probably." And he said, "But this is just my boundary. This is where I'm at. I'm not judging it. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it doesn't resonate for me." And he said, "Okay." Flash forward to the second part of the story, where he's talking to the same colleague at some point later down the road. And after the colleague is in service, the colleague is flustered, because this time I believe it's his spiritual center or his church. And his team, his music team, decides to sing something that was kind of like drab and dreary in his thoughts. It was sort of like very like what my colleague said was like almost like a Catholic kind of hymn, sort of like very dark and harsh and what have you. So this spiritual leader was upset about it and was like, "Oh, I can't believe they made that decision. This is not the vibe of our church. What's wrong with them?" kind of thing. And so my friend said to him, "Well, did they like it? Did the spiritual team like it?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Well, did you look around? Did you seem like other people resonated with it and liked it?" And the gentleman said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, okay, so there was some connection there, it just wasn't for you." And he said, "Yeah." So my friend says to him, "Do you like hot dogs?" And the funny part of this story is that this church or spiritual center was known for hot dogs at fellowship. Every Sunday, the spiritual leader brought hot dogs. And so he said to him, "Do you like hot dogs?" And he said, "Well, yeah, of course I love hot dogs. That's why I bring them every Sunday." And he said, "Well, why do you bring hot dogs?" And they bring hot dogs because they're fun, they're funny, it becomes this community connection, it's this conversation piece, it sets us apart, it's something different, and it's just become part of what we do. I don't know. And he said, "Okay, but are the hot dogs really, really important to the teachings? Are they truth?" And the gentleman said, "Well, no, they're not." And so my friend said to him, "The teachings, the principle is what's important. Not what is hanging on the wall, or not what is being sung, or not what is being brought in or brought out, or not how the material things and forms look. That is part of how we express spirituality. It is how we express our godness. It is how some people differ in the way their God light shines. But ultimately, all of that are just hot dogs." Do y'all understand that ultimately it's just like a hot dog? It's a thing. As we move forward into this month and our homecoming time, as we move forward into this idea of what we're doing, we have to be really careful to stick to spiritual principle. We have to be able to stick to what we're doing, because there is only principle. The principle of love, the principle of life, the principle of oneness, however you want to understand it, there is only principle. The rest is just hot dogs. We risk truth when we focus on these externalities. We risk truth when we start creating barriers that we don't want to cross, when we create walls instead of boundaries. See, boundaries are changeable, they're malleable, but boundaries are fixed. Rather, walls are fixed. How fixed are your walls? How malleable are your boundaries? Are we willing to risk the one power, the one presence, and the one wisdom that we are knowing we are and cultivating? So I close by just saying, I love for us to really think through what that means for our community. How are we engaging in principle of love and acceptance and tolerance and forgiveness and fearlessness and not being stuck on what is right or what is wrong, but maybe could we even consider, like in comedy, in improv, that it's not either or, but both and? What if we engaged in a both and spirituality that fed everyone? So, my friends, ketchup or no ketchup? I mean, I don't know. Your call, hot dog or no hot dog. I mean, I don't know. But what I do know is this community is called to greatness. We have a 106-year legacy that we have the spiritual responsibility to continue to uphold. And that means sometimes adapting, and that means sometimes shifting, and that sometimes mean including things that you didn't think you would, like a hot dog. So I leave that with you to think. There is only principle. The rest is just hot dogs. And so it is.